The document had been classified for 11 years. When it was finally released, most of it was still black. Page after page of redacted lines, names buried under ink, locations reduced to coordinates nobody was supposed to remember. A Freedom of Information request had pried it loose from a filing cabinet somewhere in the bowels of the Department of Defense, and what came out looked less like a military report and more like a piece of modern art. Black rectangles where answers should have been. White space where the truth used to live. But one line survived. Near the bottom of page 7, whoever had done the redacting had missed something. Maybe they were tired. Maybe they thought it didn't matter. One line, 11 words sitting alone on the page like a headstone in an empty field. Asset designation, Ghost 1. All 11 personnel returned alive. That was it. No explanation, no names. No account of how 11 men walked out of a province that had swallowed better-equipped units whole. Just that designation and that number and the silence surrounding both of them. 11 men went in, 11 came home. Nobody was supposed to. This is how it happened. Fort Bragg sits in the Carolina Sandhills like it has always been there, like the land grew up around it rather than the other way around. In November, the pines hold their color while everything else gives up and goes brown. The cold comes in off the flatlands without warning, slipping under doors, finding gaps in gear that soldiers swore were sealed. It is not a dramatic cold. It does not announce itself. It simply arrives and stays. Building 4 Alpha was one of the older structures on post, the kind of place where the plywood floors had absorbed enough bootsteps to carry their own sound, a low resonance under every footfall, like the building itself was keeping count. The operations tent had been replaced years ago by concrete and fluorescent lighting, but the men who worked inside still called it the tent out of habit. Old habits in old buildings. The Army ran on both. At 03:40 on a Tuesday morning in late November 11, Marines from Recon Bravo had gone dark. Not silent. Dark. There is a difference. Silent means no radio traffic, which can mean discipline, which can mean they are moving through something they do not want to announce. Dark means the signal is gone. The equipment is gone. The heartbeat of the unit, that faint electronic pulse that every modern patrol sends back to the people watching the screens, had simply stopped. 22 minutes of nothing, and the nothing was still growing. In the operations room, the air had that particular quality that comes only in the middle of the night when something has gone wrong and nobody yet knows how wrong. 6 officers around the central table. 4 men from a naval special warfare team seated along the far wall, their body language carefully arranged to communicate that they were not worried, which is the clearest possible signal that they were. 2 intelligence analysts at their stations running queries that kept returning the same empty results. General Douglas Harmon stood at the head of the table with his hands flat on the map. He was 58 years old and built like someone had started with a larger man and compressed him, not smaller, just denser. His hair had gone fully gray in his early 50s, and he had stopped caring about it around the same time. 31 years of service had given him a face that communicated very little, which was precisely how he preferred it. Faces that communicated too much got men into trouble. He had watched it happen more times than he could count. The map under his hands showed Kunar province in the eastern reaches of Afghanistan. Valleys that ran like claw marks through the rock. Ridgelines that made every approach visible from 3 directions. The Kunar River moving south in the dark, indifferent to whatever was happening on its banks. Recon Bravo's last confirmed position was marked in grease pencil, a small circle near a village that had no strategic value except that it sat at the intersection of 2 routes that very much did. He did not look up when the door opened. Neither did most of the men in the room, because the door had opened 4 times in the last 90 minutes, and each time it had been someone with less information than the time before. The SEAL in the nearest chair glanced over, processed what he saw in about 2 seconds, and returned to the screen in front of him. One of the intelligence analysts looked up briefly, then back at his monitor. A junior captain at the far end of the table did not look up at all. Staff Sergeant Nora Reeves set her kit bag down against the wall. She did it quietly without announcement, the way you set something down when you are not interested in drawing attention to the act. Then she moved to an open position along the side wall, checked the room layout with a single sweep of her eyes, and stood still. She was 5 feet 3 inches tall, 119 pounds in her gear. She looked to the men in that room, who noticed her at all, like someone who had been sent to the wrong address. Ray Okafor noticed her. Gunnery Sergeant Ray Okafor was 44 years old and had been in the Marines for 22 of those years, which meant he had developed the particular skill of seeing things without appearing to look at them. He was seated in a chair near the corner of the room, the chair he always chose in rooms like this, back to the wall, Full sightlines, not central enough to be involved in conversations he had not initiated. He had a cup of coffee he was not drinking. He had been watching the door. When Nora Reeves came through it, he set the cup down. Not dramatically, not as a signal. He simply put it on the floor beside his chair and did not pick it up again. Nobody else in the room saw him do it. The 26-minute mark passed, then 30. The analysts ran their queries. The SEAL team consulted quietly among themselves, the murmur of men who had opinions they had not yet been asked to share. General Harmon had not moved from his position at the map table. He was reading the terrain the way old soldiers read terrain, not looking for what was there, but looking for what the terrain wanted to happen. Every landscape had preferences. Kunar province preferred ambushes. It preferred the attacking force to come from the high ground on the north side of the valley because that was where the sight lines opened up and the escape routes closed down. He had seen it before. He had written the briefing that described it. The pattern was so established that knowing it provided almost no advantage at all because the people using the terrain knew it too. He was thinking about the third valley north when something in the room changed. Harmon had learned long ago that rooms had their own atmospheres, distinct as weather systems, and that certain people could change them the moment they walked in. Not through noise or visible authority, something subtler than all of those things. He had felt it only a handful of times in his career, and each time it had unsettled him because he did not entirely trust things he could not quantify. He looked up from the map. Nora Reeves was standing against the wall, still quiet, apparently unremarkable in every way that could be measured. But the room had shifted around her. The SEAL who had dismissed her was looking at his screen with a concentration that had not been there 30 seconds ago. The junior captain, who had not looked up when she entered, was now looking at everything except the wall where she stood. The intelligence analyst nearest to her had leaned almost imperceptibly away. Harmon straightened. He had been doing this long enough to be skeptical of atmospheres. Atmospheres were made of rumors and suggestion, and the human tendency to find patterns in noise. He had seen reputations grow like tumors in forward operating bases fed by fear and boredom, and the desperate need to believe that someone somewhere knew what they were doing. Those reputations got men killed. They created expectations that exceeded reality, and when the gap between expectation and fact finally closed, it closed violently and people paid with their lives. He walked around the table. His boots struck the floor with the particular cadence of a man who had never found any reason to soften his footsteps. The room organized itself around his approach. Conversation stopped. Eyes moved. The SEAL team straightened slightly in their chairs. He stopped in front of Nora Reeves. She did not step back. She did not adjust her posture. She looked at a point approximately at his collarbone, the correct position for a subordinate addressing a superior, and she waited. Her breathing was not visible. Her hands were at her sides. Name and unit, Harmon said. His voice was the same voice he used for everything: medium, volume, flat affect designed to carry without effort and land without warmth. It was a voice that had ended careers and begun operations and delivered news that could not be taken back. He used it the same way a carpenter uses a hammer. Tool, not expression. Staff Sergeant Nora Reeves, 1st Reconnaissance Battalion, sir. Her voice was quieter than his, not from deference, from economy. The words carried because they were precisely as loud as they needed to be and no louder. Harmon held her gaze for a moment. Her eyes were steady, the particular stillness of someone who had learned to go calm in the places most people went loud. He had read her file. 3 hours ago, when her name appeared on the supplemental roster, he had pulled it and gone through it the way he went through every file, looking for the shape of a person underneath the numbers and commendations. What he found was a Marine with 12 years of service, a record that was clean to the point of almost being suspect, 2 deployments to Iraq and 1 to eastern Afghanistan, and then a notation that had made him pause. 2 years of restricted duty following an incident in Ramadi. The incident itself was cited but not detailed. The restriction had been lifted 14 months ago. He had also seen the commendations. He had read the after-action reports, the ones that reached him through channels that were not supposed to reach him, the reports that came filtered through 3 layers of review and still arrived on his desk carrying language that men in his position almost never used. Impossible. Inexplicable. The section marked asset determination had been blank in 2 of the 3 reports, as if whoever wrote it had started to fill it in and then thought better of putting the name down on paper. What he had not believed were the whispers. He did not believe in whispers. "I've seen your jacket, Sergeant," he said. 2 years restricted following Ramadi. He let that sit for a moment. "Explain that." Nora Reeves did not move. The room was paying careful attention while pretending not to. I made a judgment call, sir. It cost the mission its secondary objective. That was all she said. No elaboration, no defense, no request for context or fairness. One of the SEALs shifted in his chair, the sound of fabric against plastic in a room that had gone very quiet. Harmon let another moment pass. He was looking at her face and she was letting him look, which was either composure or indifference, and he had not yet determined which. Then he asked the question. Call sign. The words dropped into the room like a stone into still water. Whatever residual noise had been running under the conversation in the operations room, the low hum of men occupying shared space, the mechanical sounds of the equipment, the breath and shift and ambient presence of 12 people in a concrete room, it stopped. Not because anyone made a conscious decision to be silent, because silence was the body's involuntary response to something it recognizes before the mind catches up. Nora Reeves lifted her chin a degree. No more. Ghost one, sir. 2 words. Quiet as the first. Stripped of everything except the fact itself. The SEAL who had glanced at her when she entered and looked away was now looking at his hands. The junior captain had gone very still. The intelligence analyst in the far corner had turned his chair slightly, the motion so small it might have been involuntary to face her. General Douglas Harmon said nothing for 4 full seconds. 4 seconds is not a long time in most contexts. In a military operations room in the presence of a superior officer who communicates primarily through economy of expression, 4 seconds of silence is a geological event. He had seen the designation before. Ghost 1. It appeared in the after-action reports he was not supposed to have in footnotes that had survived 3 redactions in a debrief transcript that someone had marked destroy and then not destroyed. He had assigned it the same value he assigned all undocumented battlefield designations. He had assumed it was the kind of name that units gave to luck. A way of explaining outcomes they could not otherwise explain. When the math stopped working and the result was still somehow alive, soldiers invented a ghost. He was reconsidering that assignment. Ray Okafor in his corner chair picked up his coffee cup. He looked at it for a moment. Then he set it back down without drinking. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then the room resumed the way rooms do cautiously, the way people re-enter water after something has moved through it. The SEALs conferred in low voices. The analysts returned to their screens. The junior captain began writing something on a notepad and then stopped as if he had lost track of what he intended to write. Harmon returned to the map table. He stood with his back to the room and looked at the greased pencil circle in the third valley and thought about the 11 men inside it. Then he picked up the greased pencil himself and drew a line from that circle to the nearest available egress route. The route ran through approximately 4 kilometers of terrain that the Taliban had been using as a transit corridor for the better part of a decade. It was by any calculation a bad route. It was also the only one. He set the grease pencil down. He turned back toward the room. He moved to the table and opened her service record, where he had left it still bookmarked to the page with the emergency contact information. He turned one page, then another. He stopped. He had known since pulling the file that he recognized the next of kin entry. He had been organizing that recognition for 3 hours, keeping it in a separate compartment, the way soldiers keep difficult things at distance managed not examined. Standing here now in the same room as the call sign, the distance collapsed. The original emergency contact crossed through with a single line, but still legible, was a name he had carried in a specific and private place for 15 years. Master Sergeant Garrett Reeves. He knew that name the way you know the names of a very small number of people in a long life. Not because you chose to keep them, but because certain names become load-bearing walls in the structure of who you are, and you cannot take them out without the rest shifting. He looked up at the woman standing against the wall of his operations room, 5 feet 3 inches, 119 pounds, call sign Ghost 1. And for the first time since pulling her file 3 hours ago, he understood why the name had sat in his chest like something unfinished. Garrett Reeves had a daughter. He had known that. He had simply not connected the knowing to the name until this moment, standing in a room at Fort Bragg at 4 in the morning with the map still open behind him. The reorganization that followed was not pleasant. It rarely was. He closed the folder. He walked to the center of the room. "You need to understand something first, Sergeant," he said. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. Legends break men. They make soldiers believe in something that cannot be broken. And when they learn it can be broken, they learn it in the worst possible moment in the worst possible place. That is not a warning I give lightly. Nora Reeves held his gaze. "Then I won't break, sir." The words were flat, not defiant, not performative. The way you state a fact that you have already verified. Harmon looked at her for a moment that was longer than the others. Something moved behind his eyes too briefly and too deep to read. He took one breath through his nose, measured and deliberate. Ghost one, he said. On point. He turned back to the map. The room began to move. Outside the operations room, the air was cold and sharp and honest. The floodlights along the perimeter threw long shadows across the gravel. Somewhere in the distance, a ground vehicle was running the low diesel sound of something that would run all night because it always ran all night. Nora Reeves stood at the edge of the light and looked at the dark. What she felt standing there was not fear. Fear for her had a specific texture, and she knew it well enough to identify it when it was present and to distinguish it from the other things that lived in the same neighborhood. What she felt was the weight of a calculation she had been running since she first saw the coordinates on the mission brief. Kunar Province. She reached into her kit bag, past the medical pack, past the comms equipment, past the magazines nested in their pouches. Her hand found the case she had carried in every deployment kit since she was 20 years old, a long, worn case that had traveled more miles than most vehicles without being opened once in the field. She did not open it now. She held it for a moment, the weight familiar and specific, and then she put it back. Her mother had called that morning. Nora had let it go to voicemail, then listened to the message on her walk across post. The voice was the same as it had always been, a particular combination of worry and love that her mother had never fully learned to separate. Call me before you go, the message said. You don't have to tell me anything. Just call. She had called. 40 seconds, long enough to confirm she was fine, long enough to hear her mother's breathing settle slightly, long enough to say the words her mother needed to hear. I won't pick up the rifle, Mom, I promise. She had said it before. Different deployments, same words. It had always been true. She breathed in 4 counts, held it 7, out 8. Not because she was afraid, because her father had taught her that clarity was not a gift. It was a practice. You built it the same way you built any skill, through repetition and discipline, and the willingness to do the work even when you did not feel like it, even when fear was standing in the room with you, even when the numbers did not add up. Especially then. Behind her, Okafor came through the door. He moved to stand beside her without invitation, which was the only way he ever positioned himself anywhere. He looked at the dark for a moment, then he said the only thing he said before they walked to the vehicles. Your father would have been on point too. He did not wait for a response. He walked toward the convoy line, and after a moment she followed. Outside in the Carolina dark, 15 years and several thousand miles from where they were going, the story of how Nora Reeves became Ghost One had started the way most real stories start. Not with a single dramatic moment, but with accumulation, repetition, the slow building of something that would matter later. Master Sergeant Garrett Reeves had been teaching his daughter to shoot since she was 13 years old. Not for war, not for anything he could have named precisely. He taught her because it was something he understood completely, and she had shown from the first morning in the backyard in Fayetteville, the combination of patience and precision that the discipline rewards above all other qualities. She could hold still. She could breathe correctly without being told twice. She had his eye, the eye that kept seeing when everything around it was trying to make it stop. He taught her to read wind in dry grass. He taught her to calculate distance by the way sound arrives from different directions. He taught her that the rifle was not a weapon first. It was an instrument of absolute attention, and the attention was what mattered, and the attention could be developed in anyone who was willing to practice it without shortcuts. She was willing. She was in the specific way of children who have inherited something from a parent without being told, already carrying what he was trying to give her. He came back from deployments and she came back from school, and they went to the range together on Saturday mornings, and he watched her become over 3 years something that he recognized and that surprised him at the same time. She shot the way he shot, not through imitation, through the same underlying architecture of patience and stillness that had been his before it was hers. He intended to tell her when she was old enough what he actually thought about that. He was not a man who said things like that easily. The Army had not made him that way. His own father had not made him that way. But he had a version of it prepared in his mind, a set of words he was waiting for the right moment to say. The right moment did not appear. In the fall of 2009 in Kunar Province, on a rock shelf above a valley that had been trying to kill American soldiers for 8 years, Master Sergeant Garrett Reeves made a decision that took 4 seconds and could not be taken back. The official record called it valor. The men who were there called it something quieter. the word they used when they meant that a man had done the thing that needed doing without stopping to calculate the cost. He was 38 years old. Nora was 15. The M24 came home in a box. It sat in the back of her closet in Fayetteville for 3 years before she could look at it without something happening in her chest that she did not have words for. Then she packed it into a kit bag when she left for boot camp, and it had been there ever since, traveling with her the way certain things travel, not because you decided to take them, but because leaving them behind was never a real option. She was 30 years old now. She had carried it through 2 deployments to Iraq, one to eastern Afghanistan, 2 years of restricted duty after an engagement in Ramadi that had cost the mission its secondary objective and cost her something she had not yet fully named, and 14 months of operational return that had rebuilt her record into the thing that appeared in General Harmon's file. She had not opened the case in the field once. She had a promise to keep. She shouldered her kit bag and walked toward the vehicles. In the operations room, Ray Okafor stood, picked up his rifle, and followed. He did not say anything to anyone as he went. He had known since the moment she walked through the door. Some people carry their call signs like armor loud and deliberate worn over the front so everyone can see it. And some people carry them the way soldiers carry the names of their dead deep in the chest, quiet away from the light. Nora Reeves walked through the November dark, and the name moved with her the way it always had, not ahead of her, not behind, but inside her, where her father had put it the night he pressed a rifle into her hands and said, quiet as the grass he was teaching her to read, "The wind tells you everything if you know how to listen." She knew how to listen. 11 men were waiting in the dark. She was already on her way. The convoy moved out at 0412. 3 vehicles, lights, low engines, held to the kind of throttle that keeps the sound close to the ground. The gravel road that ran along the eastern perimeter of Fort Bragg had been used for this kind of departure so many times that the stones had packed themselves flat, a path worn not by intention but by repetition, by the accumulated weight of men and machines leaving in the dark for places that would not appear on any map shown to civilians. Nora Reeves sat near the rear door of the second vehicle. She did not sit the way most people sit when they are waiting for something difficult. She did not lean forward with her elbows on her knees, running the scenarios again, burning through mental energy before the task had even begun. She sat straight back against the whole kit bag between her boots, eyes half closed. To anyone who did not know what they were looking at, she appeared to be resting. To Ray Okafor, seated across from her in the narrow space, she appeared to be doing exactly what she was doing. She was thinking about terrain. Corporal Tate Ellery was the youngest person in the vehicle by 8 years. 22 years old, from a small town in western Pennsylvania, the kind of town that produced Marines at a rate that the recruiting offices in larger cities never quite matched, because in small towns the idea of service still carried the weight it was supposed to carry. He had been in country twice before, both times embedded with larger units, never on an operation of this specific composition. He held his rifle across his lap, with both hands not gripping it, not relaxed with it, somewhere in between. He had tried to ask a question 40 minutes ago back in the operations room, a question about the route. Okafor had looked at him once, and he had decided not to ask it. Now he watched Nora Reeves and did not say anything. The other Marines in the vehicle had come to their own relationship with the silence. Some of them knew her by reputation, the way soldiers know the reputations that travel through the specific channels of people who have been in hard places together. Not by name always, not even by the designation that had settled the room earlier, but by the shape of the story. The story of a Marine who had come back from things that did not produce survivors. The story existed in pieces, fragments, the way all real stories exist when they are moving faster than the official record can document them. The men held those pieces and did not discuss them and did not discard them. The convoy turned east. Through the narrow window above Okafor's shoulder, the Carolina dark moved past pine trees and flat ground and the occasional hard geometry of a structure against the sky. Then the trees thickened and the structures disappeared, and there was only the dark, which was not really dark because the sky held a cold light that was not quite enough to see by, but was just enough to make the dark feel inhabited. At 0431, the communications analyst back at Building 4 Alpha transmitted a message. Nora received it through her earpiece. She did not react visibly. She processed it the way she processed all information that arrived while she was in a moving vehicle heading toward a designated location. She filed it in the correct place and kept the rest of herself pointed at the task. The message was 8 words. Route compromise confirmed. Transit 18 minutes prior to departure. 18 minutes before they had left Fort Bragg, someone or something had transmitted their route. Not a general area, the specific route. The coordinates, the sequence of approach, the estimated time of arrival at the first checkpoint. Information that precise did not leak through general carelessness. It came from a source with access to the specific operation, and it had been transmitted to someone who was waiting for it. She did not announce it to the men in the vehicle. Not because she was keeping it from them, but because the information in this moment changed nothing about what needed to happen. 11 Marines were still in the dark. The route was still the route. Knowing it had been compromised did not create another route. What it created was a requirement for a different kind of attention, and she was already paying that kind of attention. She turned her head toward Okafor. He was already looking at her. She held up 2 fingers pointed at her ear, then made a small gesture with her chin toward the front of the vehicle. He understood. He had understood before she moved. He leaned forward and said something quiet to the Marine in the forward seat, who relayed it to the driver, who adjusted their speed without asking why. The convoy slowed. Tate Ellery watched all of this happen. He did not understand the specific content of the communication, but he understood that something had changed, and that the change had come from the woman sitting across from him with her eyes half open, and that no one in the vehicle had questioned it. He adjusted his grip on his rifle. This time he held it properly. The approach to the valley took 40 minutes. The road deteriorated as they moved east, the maintained surface giving way to packed dirt, then to the kind of path that was a road primarily because vehicles had been using it and not because anyone had built it to be one. The mountains were not visible yet in the dark, but they were present. You could feel the way the air changed, the way the cold took on a different quality at altitude, drier and more direct. The kind of cold that bypassed the skin and went straight to the bone. Nora was out of the vehicle before it fully stopped. She moved to the front of the convoy low and quick and stood at the edge of the road where the last navigable surface gave way to the broken ground of the valley approach. She stood there for 30 seconds, not looking, listening, feeling the air on her face the way her father had taught her to feel it, not as weather but as information. The direction it was moving, the temperature differential between her left side and her right, the small signals that the body registers below the level of conscious thought. The valley was quiet. It was the wrong kind of quiet. She went to one knee and looked at the far ridgeline. Even in the darkness, she could read the angles. The high ground on the north side ran at approximately 30 degrees off vertical and was broken by a series of rock formations that would provide excellent cover for a static position. The south side was lower, more exposed, less useful to someone who intended to stay hidden. The valley floor was maybe 200 meters across at its widest point, narrowing as it moved east toward the village coordinates in the mission brief. The village was approximately 1.4 kilometers ahead. She counted 4 structures, visible even in this light, low and flat, and the color of the ground they sat on. The kind of structures that had been there long enough to become part of the landscape, built from what the landscape offered, designed not for permanence but for continuation. She went back to the convoy. Position, she said. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to carry far. It needed to carry to the men it was directed at and no further. The Marines and the SEAL team element that had joined them at the last waypoint came off the vehicles and moved to the dispersal positions she had indicated on the route map during the briefing. She watched them move, tracking each element to its position, adjusting one man who had drifted 2 meters too far to the left and would have been silhouetted against the sky. Tate Ellery moved to her right flank and stayed there. He was doing it consciously. She could see that the deliberate positioning of a young soldier who had made a decision to stay close to the person he trusted most in the formation. She did not tell him to move. His instinct was tactically sound, even if his reasoning was based on something other than tactics. Ray Okafor took a position 10 meters to her left, slightly elevated on a rock shelf that gave him sightlines in 3 directions. He did not say anything. He carried his rifle with the loose readiness of a man who had been in this configuration more times than he had a precise count for. They moved into the valley. The first 200 meters passed without incident. The ground was uneven, the kind of surface that demands complete attention because the same step taken twice lands differently each time. She moved point at a pace that balanced speed with silence, fast enough to maintain momentum, slow enough that every footfall was placed rather than dropped. Behind her, the column matched their breathing to their footsteps, the way experienced soldiers do, making themselves part of the dark rather than things moving through it. At the 240-meter mark, she stopped. She did not raise her fist. She did not use a hand signal. She stopped walking, and the column stopped behind her, the stillness traveling from front to rear in a wave. Tate Ellery on her right froze mid-step. She was looking at the building on the left side of the path. It was a single-story structure, roofline maybe 4 meters at the peak, with a window on the north face that was approximately 1 meter wide. The window was dark. Every window in the valley was dark at this hour. This one was dark in a slightly different way, a darkness that had depth to it that receded further than the surface of the glass should allow. Someone was standing in it, standing back from the frame in the dark watching the path. She processed this information. She processed the implications. She processed the angle from that window to the position Tate Ellery currently occupied, and she moved him with one hand on his shoulder 2 steps to the left before she fully completed the calculation, because the calculation was already running in the part of her that did not wait for conscious permission. Then the valley opened its mouth. The first shot came from the north ridgeline. It did not hit anyone. It was not aimed to hit anyone, it was aimed to locate them, to force a reaction, to establish where the column was and how it would respond. The crack of it broke against the valley walls and came back fractured, so that the echo arrived from 3 directions simultaneously and made the source impossible to pinpoint by ear alone. Then the second shot came, and the third, and then it was not individual shots anymore. The volume of fire that opened up from the north ridge was systematic, not wild, not panicked. Coordinated overlapping fields of fire from at least 3 elevated positions designed to seal the valley floor and prevent the kind of organized movement that would allow the column to reach the village. Dust kicked up around Nora's boots. She felt the pressure displacement of a round passing close before she heard it. Down. Cover. She said it once flat and clear, and the column dropped and moved. Men found what cover the valley offered, which was not generous. Low rock formations, a crumbled wall section that had been a structure of some kind a long time ago, the gentle depressions in the ground that become significant when the alternative is open air. The SEAL team element moved to the south side and established a base of fire disciplined and effective, working the ridgeline positions with controlled 3-round bursts. It was not enough. The positions on the ridge were well selected. Deep cover angular approach, the kind of placement that absorbs return fire without changing the shooter's ability to continue working. She knew this kind of placement because she had studied the terrain reports from the last 3 years of operations in this province, and because she had a specific and detailed understanding of how these positions were constructed. She knew what they looked like from below, and she knew what they required, and what they required was a different angle of approach than anything available on the valley floor. She moved, not toward the ridge, not directly. She moved along the south wall of the crumbled structure, staying tight to what cover existed, keeping her body below the profiles that would be visible from the north face. The fire was loud, and the dark was full of motion, and nobody was tracking her specific position in the chaos of the engagement, which was the only thing she needed. She found the break in the south wall where the ground rose slightly before flattening again. She went up it on her hands and her feet, moving the way she had moved in training and in the 2 deployments before this one. The way movement becomes when fear is not driving it, deliberate and efficient, each contact with the ground, a placement rather than an accident. From the elevated position, she could see the first of the North Ridge firing points. 2 men good cover, working a rhythm. She read the rhythm the way her father had taught her to read wind. Everything that was regular had a pattern, and every pattern had a gap, and the gap was where you moved. She waited for the gap. When it came, she crossed the open ground to the base of the North Ridge. The climb took 4 minutes. The rock was cold, and the handholds were marginal, and she moved with the discipline of a person who cannot afford to rush, because rushing on uncertain rock in the dark produces falls, and falls produce sounds, and sounds produce outcomes she was not prepared to accept. Her breathing stayed controlled. In 4 counts, hold, out 8. The air at this elevation had a quality like cold metal, clean and hard. She came up behind the first position from the south. She did not think about it after the first shot. She was already moving to the second position, the sound of her own rifle absorbed into the general noise of the engagement below, and the second position was occupied by one man who had not yet understood what had changed in the tactical picture, and then he understood, and then she was moving to the third. The third position was further along the ridge. She moved at a run between the second and third, using the rock formations for cover, navigating by the memory of the aerial photograph she had studied 3 hours ago in the operations room. The photograph had been taken at a different time of day in a different season, and the shadows fell differently now, but the fixed elements were the same. Rock does not move. She was 6 meters from the third position when the angle changed. There was a man she had not counted. He was not at the designated position. He was at a secondary position, a shelf of rock below, and to the right of the primary, a location that did not appear in the aerial photograph, because at that angle and in that light it was invisible. He had been watching the ridge approach, watching for exactly what she was doing. He fired. The round went through her right hand. It was not the way pain usually arrives, as a specific sensation with a location and a quality. It arrived as an event, a hard, complete fact, the way a door slamming in a quiet house arrives. Her hand opened. The rifle dropped. She heard it hit the rock before she felt the full weight of what had happened. She used her right forearm to pin the rifle against the rock face. She reached across her body with her left hand, took the grip, and fired 3 times at the secondary position. The return fire stopped. She held the rifle with her left hand against her hip barrel forward and breathed. Below in the valley, the engagement was still running, but she could hear the character of it changing. The coordinated rhythm of the ridge positions had broken. The SEAL team was pushing forward. She could hear Okafor's voice on the comms, low and precise, calling adjustments, the way he did everything without waste. Her right hand was bleeding. She could feel the blood moving down her wrist and into her sleeve, warm against the cold air. She did not look at it. Looking at it would not change what it was. She made her way back down the ridge. Okafor was there when she reached the valley floor. He did not say anything when he saw her hand. He took her right wrist, not roughly, and turned it to assess the damage with a small light held low. His face was a professional surface while he worked. He had field-dressed wounds in conditions that made this one seem comfortable, and he moved through the process with the economy of someone whose hands had done it enough times to work without direction. The round had entered through the back of the hand between the second and third metacarpals and exited through the palm. Clean transit. No bone fragments in the entry wound, though he could not be certain of the palm. He packed it and wrapped it and taped the dressing in place with the brisk efficiency of a man who was already thinking about the next problem. Tate Ellery was standing 5 meters away watching. He had a question on his face that he did not ask. She saw it and did not address it. The question was not about the wound. The question was the one that young soldiers ask when they see something they did not previously think was possible, when the distance between what they understood about the world and what they are watching collapses all at once. The comms analyst's voice came through the earpiece. Source of transit identified. External relay station grid reference. 879er hardware. Compromised remote operation. No internal source. She processed this without expression. The route had not been leaked by anyone in the formation. There was no compromised soldier, no betrayal from inside. A relay station somewhere in the network had been turned into a listening device, its signal captured and retransmitted by someone with the technical capability to do it from a distance. It was a different kind of threat, and in some ways a more dangerous one, because it had no face and no location within her reach, and the only response available to her was to accept that the enemy had known they were coming and to continue anyway. She flexed the fingers of her right hand inside the dressing. The middle 2 did not respond correctly. The others moved reluctantly with the specific heaviness of damaged tissue operating against pressure. She noted this. She filed it accurately. She did not allow herself to follow the thought to its logical end, which was a thought she could not afford to complete until the mission was finished. The valley had gone quiet. Not the wrong kind of quiet this time. The quiet of a space that had been used for violence and was now recovering from it, the way a room recovers from a loud sound, gradually the silence returning from the edges inward. They had 4 Marines from her own element still operational. The SEAL team had 1 man with a through and through in the upper arm walking wounded functional. Tate Ellery was untouched. Recon Bravo was still somewhere ahead in the dark. She looked at Okafor. He was already looking at her. Forward, she said. The industrial compound was 300 meters east of the engagement site. It had been a processing facility of some kind, once the kind of structure that had served an economic function that no longer existed in this part of the province. The main building was 4 stories concrete, with the specific decay of structures that were built to last and then abandoned before anyone got around to finishing the process of lasting. The windows on the upper floors were empty frames. The ground level had been partially reinforced at some point with additional material, irregular and improvised, the way structures get reinforced when someone decides they want them to hold rather than fall. She read the structure from 200 meters out. The ground floor had 3 visible entry points. The roof line was intact on the south face and partially collapsed on the north. The structure sat at the east end of a clear area, approximately 80 meters of open ground on 3 sides, which was not an accident. Clear ground around a structure is a tactical decision as much as anything else. It forces approaching forces into the open. She went to her stomach behind a low berm and glassed the structure with her monocular, moving systematically ground floor to roofline north face to south. She was looking for light, for movement, for the small behavioral signals that people emit even when they are trying not to. She found what she was looking for on the south face second floor. A thermal signature faint in the window second from the right. A person maintaining still in a position that had been occupied long enough to leave a residual warmth on the surrounding material. A watch position. Patient professional covering the open ground to the south, which meant anyone approaching from the south would be seen. She worked through the geometry. The watch position on the second floor had sight lines covering the south approach and the east approach. The north face of the structure back toward the ridgeline and approaching from the north meant traversing the same terrain she had just come down, from which was possible but slow. The west approach, which was the direction they had come from, was the most exposed. There was a structure 30 meters to the southwest of the main building, lower single-story collapsed roof on the western end. It created a partial defilade from the second floor watch position if you approached at the correct angle and stayed below a certain height. She could get to within 40 meters of the main building using that approach. 40 meters of open ground would remain. At 40 meters, the watch position could not miss. She was thinking about this when the comms crackled. Bravo element. She heard it and felt her chest tighten once the single moment of involuntary response she permitted herself. The voice was Corporal Haskell Recon Bravo's senior radio operator, and it was the first transmission from Bravo in 48 minutes. The transmission was fragmented, the signal fighting through something, and what came through was partial. Subsurface. 4 down, limited. Request. She pressed transmit. Bravo repeat. Static. Then clearer. Basement level. 4 wounded. 1 critical. The ammunition 2 mags per man. We are stable, but we cannot move. She calculated what she had heard against what she knew about the structure. A basement level meant a below-grade space, which meant the thermal imaging she had been using would not locate them. It also meant that extraction required either clearing the structure from the top down or creating a ground-level entry point that bypassed the upper floor security. Both options required suppressing the watch position first. She looked at the structure. She looked at the open ground. She looked at the angles. Then she looked at the terrain to the northwest, where a rock shelf rose to approximately 14 meters before leveling out, and she calculated the distance from that shelf to the main building, 820 meters. She held that number for a moment. She turned it over the way you turn a stone to see what is under it. 820 meters was not an exceptional distance in the technical sense. It was within the documented range of the equipment. It was within her documented capability historically in conditions that had been comparable to these. Wind from the west at approximately 12 knots, consistent with what she had felt on her face during the approach. Temperature differential between the valley floor and the shelf would create a slight upward deflection at the mid-range point correctable for. The shot was possible. The shot was possible if you had 2 working hands. She looked at the dressing on her right hand. She looked at the rock shelf. She looked at Okafor. He was already standing. He moved to her kit bag without asking permission and opened it with the deliberate hands of a man who knew exactly what he was looking for and where it was. He had known since the operations room. He had known since before that, probably in the way that quiet men who pay the right kind of attention tend to know things before they are told them. He found the case. He lifted it out. Long and worn, the latches slightly tarnished, the exterior softened by 15 years of travel in the dark of a kit bag that had crossed 2 continents without ever being set down. He held it out to her. He did not say anything. His face was the same professional surface it had been when he dressed her hand. He was not asking her a question. He was not making an argument. He was doing what this quiet observer does. When the moment arrives, he was placing the fact in front of her and stepping back. She did not take it immediately. She looked at it for a moment, the worn case in his hands, the specific weight of it, communicable even through the air, the accumulated meaning of 15 years of carrying without opening. Tate Ellery was crouched behind the berm 8 meters away. He was looking at the structure. He had positioned himself exactly where the geometry of the terrain required him to be if anyone was going to move on the southwest approach, which meant he had been thinking about the problem, working it out in his own way. He was 22 years old and he had been in the valley for less than an hour, and he had not once put himself in a position that was not tactically sound. Her mother's voice was in her ear. Not literally. The voicemail played once at 0300 in a room at Fort Bragg was not a thing she could hear. But it was there the way certain things are. They are not as sound, but as weight. I won't pick up the rifle, I promise. She looked at the structure. She calculated the watch position angle. She calculated what would happen when the man in that position acquired the southwest approach and found Tate Ellery in the open ground. 40 seconds, maybe. She took the case from Okafor's hands. She opened it. The M24 looked exactly the way it had always looked, the stock with the slight shine along the grip, the scope with the small notch on the left turret from a rock face in 2004 that had never affected the function. 15 years in the case, and it was the same rifle, unchanged by any of it, patient in the way that objects are patient, indifferent to time and grief, in the complicated distance between a 15-year-old girl and the 30-year-old woman who still carried it everywhere she went. She assembled it with her left hand as primary and her right forearm as support. It was slow. It was not the way she would have done it before. She noted the slowness and accepted it and continued. She looked at the rock shelf. She looked at Okafor. He moved 2 fingers in the direction of the shelf and then held up his fist, which meant he would hold the formation until she was in position. She nodded once. Then she moved. The approach to the shelf took 7 minutes. She moved along the ridge line's lower face using the same cover instinct that had carried her up and back in the engagement earlier, placing each step reading the rock, keeping her body below the angles that mattered. The M24 was across her back, the familiar weight of it different now, or perhaps not different at all, perhaps exactly what it had always been, and she was the thing that had changed. She reached the shelf and went prone. The wind was from the west, 12 knots consistent. She read the dry grass in the valley floor below, the way it bent and recovered, and she confirmed the reading against the physical sensation on the left side of her face. Her father's voice was somewhere in the arithmetic of it, not as a hallucination, not as sentiment, but as knowledge embedded in the part of her that knew how to do this because he had taught her, and she had learned, and the learning had not stopped being real because he was no longer there to confirm it. She settled the M24 against her left shoulder. She had shot left-handed in training a dozen times 100, not at this distance, not with a damaged right hand providing the only support available. She took a breath and let it out and felt a tremor in the dressing and noted it and accepted it as a variable. The watch position was in the scope. The man was patient. He was good at his job. He had been in that window for a long time, and he had not moved significantly, which meant his discipline was real and his cover was real, and the only thing that was not in his favor was that he did not know she was on the shelf. She read the grass. She made the adjustments. She thought of her father's hands on her shoulders on a cold morning years ago in North Carolina, the weight of them, the specific steadiness of a man who had learned to be still in places that wanted him to panic. She thought of his voice on a shelf above a different valley in a different year, quiet as the grass he was teaching her to read. The rifle doesn't kill Nora. Panic does. She breathed in. She held it. She let the tremor settle to its lowest point. She put the pressure on the triggers the way he had taught her, not a pull, a squeeze, gradual and committed, the kind of pressure that means what it says. She fired. 1 round. The watch position went quiet. Below on the open ground, Tate Ellery was already moving. The round was still traveling when Tate Ellery broke from cover. He moved low and fast across the open ground, the way young soldiers move when they have made the decision, and the decision has overtaken the fear, all forward motion, no looking back. The 40 meters of open ground that had been the problem in every calculation passed beneath his boots in seconds. He reached the wall of the main building and pressed flat against it, rifle up, checking the angle to the door. The door was 3 meters to his right. He looked back toward the berm. 2 Marines were already moving using the defilade of the collapsed subsidiary structure, the way she had mapped it for them without saying a word, staying below the angle of the now silent watch position, reaching the wall 10 seconds behind Ellery. Ray Okafor was on the southwest corner of the open ground with 2 more Marines providing overwatch on the upper floors. He moved his team with small hand signals. Economical, precise, the kind of communication that works because the men receiving it have learned to read it through repetition and trust, rather than explicit instruction. Nora came off the rock shelf at a controlled descent. Her right hand was not useful for the climb down. She used her left and her forearms in the friction of her boots against the rock, moving through the geometry of the descent with the same deliberateness she had used for the ascent. The M24 was across her back. She could feel it there, the way you feel something that has always been present, but not always acknowledged, a weight that had become familiar enough to be part of the body's own accounting of itself. She reached the valley floor and moved toward the building at a run. The compound was not fully silent. There were sounds coming from the upper floor's movement and voices, the disorganized noise of a security element that had just lost its primary eyes and was trying to reorient without knowing the new geometry of the threat. That disorientation was a resource. and it had a duration, and the duration was not long. She came around the southwest corner and found Ellery at the door with his hand up. He had stopped because the door opened inward, and the threshold was dark, and there was no way to know from outside what was waiting on the other side of it. This was the correct tactical decision. She noted it without expressing it. She took a position on the left side of the doorframe. The Marine to Ellery's right took the right side. She counted once with her fingers, 2, 3, and the Marine went through low, and she went through high, and the room they entered was empty. Concrete floor, no furniture, one interior door on the far wall, a staircase running up on the right side. The staircase was the problem they had expected. Anyone coming down it would have the height advantage for approximately 4 steps before the angle equalized, and 4 steps was enough. She put 2 men on the staircase with instructions that did not require words, just position and a pointed finger, and took the interior door herself with Ellery behind her. The interior door opened onto a short corridor. At the end of the corridor, another door, this one heavier, partially reinforced with the same improvised material she had seen on the outside. A padlock on the exterior hasp, which told her 2 things at once. Whatever was on the other side was being kept in, not kept out. And whatever was on the other side was still there. She used the butt of her rifle on the padlock twice. The hasp was the weak point, not the lock, and the hasp gave on the second strike, the screws pulling through the deteriorated wood of the frame. She pushed the door. The staircase behind it went down. The basement of the processing facility was approximately 12 meters wide and 8 deep, with a ceiling low enough that the taller men would need to watch their heads on the support beams. It smelled of concrete dust and copper, and the particular animal warmth of bodies that had been in an enclosed space for an extended period. They were in the far corner. 11 Marines from Recon Bravo, arranged with the instinctive order of a unit that has gone to ground and organized itself around its wounded. 4 men down, 2 lying flat, 2 propped against the wall with field dressings showing through the tears in their uniforms. 1 man, the one Haskell had classified as critical, was unconscious, his breathing audible even from the doorway, a sound with an irregular quality that needed medical attention faster than the word critical communicated. 7 men were operational, rifles up when the door opened, down when they identified the uniforms. Haskell was the first one to speak. He said one word, finally. Nora moved to the critical casualty. She went to one knee and checked his airway first, then his pulse at the neck, then the dressing on his abdomen that had been applied with skill but was now saturated. She pulled a fresh dressing from her kit and reset the pressure application. Her right hand could not grip, but she could use the forearm as a platform, and her left hand did the work. Haskell watched her without speaking. She worked quickly and she worked well, and when she stood up, the man's breathing had stabilized to a less alarming rhythm. Not good. Stable was not good. Stable meant there was a window, and the window had a duration, and the duration required they use it immediately. She looked at Okafor at the top of the stairs. She held up 11 fingers, then pointed up. He understood. He disappeared back into the corridor. She turned to Haskell. Can your men move? He looked at his people the way a sergeant looks at his people, the specific assessment of someone who knows each component personally. They can move. Then they move now. The extraction was not clean. Clean extractions happened when the variables cooperated, when the route was uncontested, when the wounded could be moved at pace, when the opposing force had been sufficiently suppressed to remain out of the equation for the duration of the withdrawal. 2 of the 4 variables were present. The route was partially open. The upper floors of the structure had been cleared by Okafor's element during the time she spent in the basement. 4 contacts neutralized the remainder of the security element, having made the decision that the tactical picture had changed in a direction they did not wish to pursue. The route was the problem, and the wounded set the pace. She put the 2 walking wounded in the middle of the column bracketed by Bravo's operational men. The critical casualty required a 2-man carry, which she organized from Ellery and a Bravo Marine of comparable size, the kind of physical problem that resolves itself when you match the bodies to the load correctly. She walked the rear of the column. This was not a gesture. It was not symbolic. It was the correct position for the person responsible for making sure the column completed its movement, because the rear is where stragglers develop and where trailing contact arrives first, and both of those things require a specific quality of attention that she trusted herself to provide. Okafor took point. They moved out of the compound in the pre-dawn dark across the open ground through the partial cover of the subsidiary structure back into the valley approach. The valley was quiet with the quiet that follows violence, a recovery, silence different in character from the silence that precedes it. At the 150-meter mark, the trailing contact arrived. It was not a coordinated engagement. It was three men on the valley's south face who had worked their way around during the building operation and found a position that gave them a low angle on the withdrawal route. The fire was accurate enough to matter rounds skipping off the rock near the rear of the column, one close enough to the two-man carry team to make Ellery break stride. Nora did not break stride. She turned, went to one knee, and put three rounds into the south face position with her left hand working the trigger between the natural rests of her breathing cycle, the way she had been taught in a different valley in a different year and had not forgotten. The positions on the south face went quiet after the third round. She did not know if she had hit anyone or if the suppression alone had been sufficient, and she did not wait to find out. She stood. She looked at the column. Forward, she said. The column moved. She was the last person through the vehicle door. She counted them in the way she counted things that mattered one at a time, each body accounting for itself. 21 ahead of her, in the 22nd position was hers, and she took it, and the door closed, and the vehicle began to move before she had fully seated herself. Ellery was directly across from her. His face had the look that faces get when they have been through something that has revised their understanding of the world. Not shocked exactly, not traumatized, but recalibrated. The internal landscape adjusted to accommodate new information. He was looking at the M24 across her knees. He did not ask about it. He looked at her hand instead. The dressing had bled through in two places. The blood had dried to a rust color that was darker in the vehicle's interior light, and the fingers that emerged from the top of the dressing were swollen enough to be visible even in poor light. The middle two had not moved since the rock shelf. She had not attempted to move them in the time since, because attempting to move them would have produced information she did not have a use for until the mission was complete, and the mission was not yet complete. She looked at Ellery. He looked back at her. She saw in his face the thing that young soldiers carry when they understand they would have been dead. Without an intervention, they did not earn the specific weight of that understanding, the way it settles differently from ordinary gratitude. It is not a comfortable thing to carry. Some men spend the rest of their lives arranging themselves around it. She looked at the M24 on her knees, and she put her left hand on the stock, and the familiar weight of it traveled up her arm and settled somewhere in the chest, in the specific place that grief and inheritance occupy when they have been given enough time to become indistinguishable from each other. Outside, the Carolina dawn was beginning. Not visible yet, just suggested a change in the quality of the dark that preceded the light by 30 minutes, the way silence changes before sound arrives. The pines along the route were becoming individual again, separating from the general mass of darkness into particular shapes. 22 people breathing in 3 vehicles. She had counted them, every one of them present. She breathed in 4 counts, held it, let it go. Fort Bragg received them at 0611. The vehicles rolled through the eastern gate and along the perimeter road, and the smell of the post arrived through the vents, that specific compound of diesel and cold air, an institutional cleaning product that was identical on every military installation she had ever been in, on the smell of a place that continued regardless of what happened outside its perimeter. Medics were waiting. They moved to the vehicles before the engines were fully off, the coordinated efficiency of people who had been told what was coming and had organized themselves accordingly. The critical casualty was out, first his carry team handing him over with the practiced transfer of men, giving something important to other people who will know what to do with it. The walking wounded followed. The operational men came last, moving with the particular gait of people whose bodies have been in high gear for an extended period and are only now beginning the process of coming down from it. Nora stepped out of the vehicle and stood on the gravel and breathed the Fort Bragg air. She stood there for one moment only. One moment to let the ground be real under her feet, to let the familiar perimeter be what it was, to complete the transition from the valley to this place which was not safe exactly, but was known, and known was its own category of relief. Then she shouldered the M24 and walked toward Building 4 Alpha. General Douglas Harmon was standing at the door. He had his arms crossed and his face in the expression that it defaulted to when he was observing, rather than acting flat and attentive, the face of a man receiving information and organizing it before responding to it. He watched the medical teams work. He watched the wounded being transported. He was counting the way she had counted in the vehicle, the same fundamental act performed differently, an officer accounting for his people against the list of people he had sent out. His eyes moved through the returning personnel with the methodical sweep of someone who has done this enough times to know exactly what he is looking for and exactly how long it takes to find it. He found it when she came through the gate. He counted her the way he had counted the others, and she was the last, which meant the count was complete, and the count was complete at 22, which meant what the declassified document had stated in its single surviving line. All 11 personnel returned alive, and 11 more who had gone to find them. His gaze moved to the M24 on her shoulder. He went very still. It was the stillness of recognition, not of surprise. The rifle was not a make or model that would stand out to most observers. It was an M24 in a worn case carried in the manner of personal equipment, nothing to distinguish it from any other long rifle being transported by any other returning operator. But Harmon had seen this specific rifle before. He had seen it in Kunar Province in the fall of 2009. He had seen the hand that held it, in the eye that looked through the scope, and he had seen what that eye and that hand produced in a valley that had been trying to kill them for 6 hours. He had not seen it since. He did not move from the door when she approached. He let her come to him, which was protocol, and also something else, the small adjustment that men make when they are in the presence of something that has changed their understanding of a situation they believe they had correctly assessed. She stopped in front of him. Harmon looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the M24. He looked at the dressing on her right hand, the blood that had dried through it in 2 places. He looked at her face, which was the same face it had been when she walked into his operations room 3 hours ago, still and controlled and giving away nothing that had not been chosen to be given. Ghost one, he said. The words carried the same deliberate weight they had carried in the operations room. The call sign said the way you say something that has passed from category to category and arrived somewhere it had not been before. Every man came home. She did not respond immediately. The gravel was solid under her boots. The floodlights threw long shadows east across the ground. Somewhere behind her, she could hear the medics working the low, professional voices of people performing tasks that required concentration. Yes, sir, she said. He nodded once. It was a small motion, barely visible. The kind of nod that a man like Harmon produces when the alternative is saying something that he has not yet found the correct words for, which is itself a rare situation for a man who has been finding words for difficult things for 31 years. He held the door. She went through. The operations room was different from what it had been at 0340. The organized tension of an active mission had resolved into the organized fatigue of its aftermath. Some of the officers had left. The intelligence analysts were writing reports. The SEAL element was gone, returned to their own area of the post, their participation in the night reduced now to a line in an after-action that would be reviewed by people who had not been in the room. Okafor was there. He had come in ahead of her, and he was standing in his corner, back to the wall with a new cup of coffee that he was also not drinking. When she came through the door, he looked at her, and then he looked at the M24, and something moved briefly across his face, a thing that was not quite a smile, and not quite relief, but existed in the neighborhood of both. He did not say anything. She set the M24 case on the table. She stood next to it for a moment. The fluorescent lights were the same lights as before. The plywood floor was the same floor. The map on the table still had the greased pencil circle in the third valley unchanged by everything that had happened since Harmon drew it. She was aware of the people in the room in the way you are aware of things at the periphery of something you are looking at directly. The junior captain, who had not looked up when she first entered, was now watching her with an expression he was not fully managing. The analyst at the far station had stopped typing. She did not look at them. She stood next to the case and let the weight of the morning settle through her. She felt the hand for the first time as a full sensation rather than a managed variable, the deep, insistent throb of damaged tissue stating its case now that it had been given permission. She heard Harmon come in behind her. He closed the door. The room organized itself around him the way it always did, the low-level awareness of a superior's presence, adjusting every other person in the space. But he walked past the table and past the map and past the analysts, and he stopped beside her rather than in front of her. He looked at the case. He put his hand on it. One hand flat on the worn exterior, the way he had put his hands on the map earlier in the morning, the same quality of contact, deliberate and heavy with what it was not saying. He stood there for a moment. She waited. Then he spoke. His voice was lower than she had heard it all morning. Not softer, lower the way a voice goes when it is no longer performing for the room and is instead doing the harder thing, which is being accurate. I was with your father, he said. Kunar Province, November 2009. She did not respond. He had his back to the room, but she was facing it, and she could see the junior captain in her peripheral vision slowly put down his pen. The analyst had gone fully still. We took contact from the northeast ridge, Harmon continued. His voice was even the cadence of a man recounting facts in the sequence. They occurred the same way he would brief an operation, because it was the only way he knew how to say difficult things. Three of us went down in the first minutes. I was next to him when the second contact began. He paused. What she was carrying in the 3 seconds of that pause was something she had been carrying for 15 years in various forms. The shape of an event that had never been explained to her in specific terms. The official notification had been exactly as official notifications always are, respectful and compressed, honoring the fact without inhabiting it. She had spent 15 years understanding the fact. She had never understood the specific shape of what happened inside it. He pushed me out of the line of fire, Harmon said. The room was completely quiet. He had seen the angle and he moved before I registered what was happening. That is not a small thing. That is not a thing that happens by instinct. That requires a specific kind of decision made fast and made completely. He stopped. She was looking at the M24 case under his hand. She was aware of her breathing the count of it in 4 the way her father had taught her to keep it even when the world was doing what it did. I never got to say it to him, Harmon said. There was not an opportunity. The way those things sometimes go, there was simply not an opportunity. And then there was no longer anyone to say it to. He lifted his hand from the case. You shoot like him. The words came out quiet and complete, not as sentiment, as verification, the way a man states something he has been certain about since the moment he recognized the rifle on her shoulder. Left hand and all, she did not say anything for a moment. She was aware of the room of Okafor in his corner, of the specific quality of the silence that the room was holding, the attentive stillness of people who understand they are present at something that is not intended for them and are choosing to remain still rather than announce themselves. She thought about her mother's voice in the voicemail. The specific quality of worry in it, the kind of worry that has been present for 15 years and has learned to live alongside the ordinary sounds of daily life without going away. She thought about the phone call at 0300, the promise she had made, and the promise she had broken on a rock shelf at 820 meters with a left hand that was her father's hand more than it had ever fully been her own. He would have hated that I broke my promise, she said. She said it quietly. Not to the room, to the man standing beside her. Harmon was quiet for 3 seconds. No, he said. He wouldn't. Nothing more. Just that. She looked at the case. She picked it up off the table. She held it at her side, the weight of it settling into her left hand with the familiarity of something that had traveled a long way to arrive at a place it was supposed to be. She looked at Harmon. He was already looking at her. The expression on his face was the one that had been behind the others all morning, the one she had seen begin to surface when he read her father's name in her file and had not been fully visible since. It was not warmth exactly, because Harmon did not traffic in warmth. It was recognition. The specific kind that passes between people who carry the same loss in different ways and understand without needing to say it that the carrying has been the point all along. She brought her left hand up in a salute. Clean and precise. He returned it the same way. Sharp, correct, brief. Nothing more needed to pass between them. Some things are complete when they are done and do not require commentary. She turned and walked out of the operations room. Outside, the Carolina morning had arrived. Not the suggestion of it anymore. The real thing, pale and flat and cold. The light coming in low from the east across the pine flats, catching the gravel of the perimeter road in a way that made each stone briefly specific before the angle moved on. The floodlights had begun to seem redundant, their contribution to the light technically present, but no longer necessary. She walked to the eastern edge of the barracks area and found the low concrete wall where the sandbags had been stacked against the perimeter fence, a fixture so permanent and unremarked that it had become part of the landscape rather than a feature of it. She sat on the wall. Her right hand rested in her lap. The dressing needed to be changed. She had a medical appointment in 2 hours, and she knew with the specific knowledge of a person who has sustained this category of damage what the appointment was likely to determine. The 2 fingers that had not responded since the rock shelf were telling her something she would eventually need to hear. She had not yet begun to fully hear it. She would, but not yet. She opened the M24 case. The rifle was the same as it had always been. She had opened the case a handful of times in 15 years to verify the condition, to apply the minimal maintenance that prevents deterioration in stored equipment, and to do the thing she could not entirely explain, which was to simply look at it to confirm it was still there, to let it be a fact in the world rather than a memory of one. She took a cloth from the external pocket of her kit bag. She began to clean the rifle. The motion was the same motion she had watched her father perform on 100 mornings before school, before deployment, on weekends in the garage when the North Carolina fall was coming through the window and the world outside was ordinary and unhurried. He had never made it seem significant. It was maintenance, practical and regular, the care of a tool that demanded care. But she had understood, even then, that it was also something else, a form of attention, a way of being present with a thing that asked for presence. She worked slowly. Her left hand was the primary. Her right did what it could, which was less than it had been, and more than nothing. She did not think about the appointment. She did not think about what the appointment would say. She thought about the motion and the weight and the specific silence of early morning on a military post when the night's work is done and the day's work has not yet begun. She heard boots on the gravel. Tate Ellery came around the corner of the barracks building with his jacket open and his rifle slung and the particular unfixed expression of a man who has been awake for 22 hours and is in the processing period that follows. He was heading toward the chow hall or back to the billets or simply moving because moving is what the body does when it does not yet know how to be still. He saw her on the wall. He stopped. He looked at her and at the rifle in her hands, and he stood there for a moment in the pale morning light, with the gravel under his boots and the pines behind him, and Fort Bragg coming awake around them both. He nodded one nod, small and direct, the same language that Harmon had used, the same language Okafor had used in his corner with his coffee cup, the language that passes between people when words are either insufficient or beside the point. She nodded back. He kept walking. She returned to the rifle. The cloth moved along the barrel in the slow, deliberate way of work that is being done correctly without hurry, with full attention. The morning light was on the metal. The weight of the rifle was in her hands. The case was open beside her on the wall, its interior showing the worn fabric that 15 years had softened further, the fitted space where the rifle had rested. All that time in the dark, traveled across 2 continents in the kit bag of a woman who had not been ready to use it and had carried it anyway. Because there are some things you carry, not because you intend to need them, but because setting them down would be a different kind of loss. The case was open now. That was different from before. From somewhere in the barracks behind, her voices drifted through a window. Men talking the ordinary register of men who are alive in the morning and have not yet organized themselves around the specific tasks of the day. The sound of it carried the particular quality of normalcy that is only audible, in contrast to what came before, the way quiet is only fully quiet, after noise, the way morning is only fully morning, after a night that required surviving. She worked the cloth along the stock, past the grip with its slight shine, past the scope with the small notch on the left turret that had been there since 2004 and had never affected the function. Her father's rifle. Her rifle. She had not yet decided exactly when the transfer had occurred, whether it was on the rock shelf the night before or 15 years ago in a funeral home in Fayetteville, or on a morning she could not identify when she had simply been carrying it long enough that the distinction between his and hers had quietly dissolved. She decided it did not matter. What mattered was the morning, the gravel and the pines and the pale flat light, and 22 people who had made it back through a valley that had not wanted them to. The rifle in her hands and the hands that were learning to be what the work required. She put the cloth down. She held the M24 across her knees for a moment, just held it the way you hold something when you are not performing any task with it and do not need to be. Then she began to put it back. The case received it the way it always had, the fitted space accommodating the rifle, with the specific rightness of things that have spent enough time together that the distinction between made for each other and made to fit no longer matters. She closed the latches. She sat on the wall in the Carolina morning and put her hand on the worn exterior of the case and let the weight of it be what it was, the weight of everything inside it and everything it had carried that was not the rifle, the years and the distance and the promise broken in the right place for the right reason in a valley that needed exactly what she had been carrying. The morning kept coming. Somewhere beyond the fence line, past the pines and the flat ground and the long institutional roads of Fort Bragg, the country was waking up in the ordinary way of countries that do not know the names of the people keeping them. Breakfast being made, traffic beginning, the unremarkable machinery of daily life turning over in the cold November light. She listened to it for a moment. Then she picked up the case and stood. She had a medical appointment in 2 hours. She had work to do before then. The rifle went back into the case that morning, but this time it wasn't hidden anymore.